Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by first looking at a few important editorials and columns. The first column, written by Jayati Ghosh, is on page number 6 and it deals with the upcoming union budget. In this column, the writer calls upon the government to provide for substantial fiscal expansion in the upcoming budget in order to create jobs and provide for basic goods and essential public services, especially considering how disproportionately the pandemic and the lockdown have hit the lower sections of the society. See, under Article 112 of the Indian Constitution, the Union government is mandated to lay down the annual financial statement, also known as the Union budget, in front of the Parliament. The budget is nothing but a statement of the estimated receipts and expenditure of the government. Through the budget, the government lays down its estimated expenditure for the financial year, including its expenditure on welfare schemes, and it proposes a revenue plan through which it hopes to raise sufficient resources in order to meet this expenditure. When the expenditure of the government overshoots the receipts, that becomes the fiscal deficit of the government, and the government also has an obligation to keep the fiscal deficit under check as per the targets that have been laid out under the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. So tomorrow, that is the 29th of Jan, the budget session of the Parliament is all set to begin, and the government would be first tabling the economic survey. The economic survey paints a picture of the Indian economy over the last one financial year, and following this, on the 1st of Feb, the government would be presenting the union budget. In short, the budget is a statement of the estimated revenues of the government and the estimated expenditure of the government. And the writer is of the opinion that every year governments provide for unrealistic estimations, and this is a predictable trend that has been noticed over the years. According to the writer, governments always tend to overestimate the revenue, and they not only underestimate the expenditure, but they also provide for inadequate allocation in critical areas. Along with this, the budget by its very nature tends to be excessively focused on the formal sector. So the writer says that if this trend repeats in the upcoming budget, then it would be a disaster for the Indian economy and the lower sections of the Indian society, considering the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown. See, currently, the government and even the RBI, they're pointing towards the strong economic recovery that India has displayed over the last 2 quarters by citing the revival in the GDP numbers. While this is true, one cannot ignore the fact that the revival in the GDP numbers over the last 2 quarters is a result of the sudden revival of demand in certain pockets, especially the urban pockets, following the lockdown. So this revival in demand, especially urban demand, has helped the large corporations to register profits again, and it has led to a massive bull run in the stock markets. These positive developments have led the government and the RBI to indicate that India is headed towards a V-shaped recovery. But as the writer points out, this only paints a partial picture of the Indian economy, because these numbers are largely limited to the formal sector of the economy, and it completely ignores the disproportionate impact of the pandemic and the lockdown on the informal sector. We all know very well that the breakout of the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns brought the informal economy to a complete standstill for several months, and many of these sectors are still struggling to revive. So this disproportionate impact of the pandemic on the informal sector has directly led to millions of job losses, thereby destroying millions of livelihoods, and it has ended up pushing millions of people into poverty and hunger. The writer's fear is that the government's budget is going to focus only on the partial revival of the economy, which is being seen only in the formal sector, and it could end up completely ignoring the hardships being faced by the informal sector. According to the writer, the finance minister's budget speech will most likely focus on the pandemic and how the government has succeeded in containing the pandemic. There is no doubt that the spread of the pandemic has come down, and even the fatality rate and the stress on the healthcare infrastructure has definitely gone down in the last few months. Along with this, the rollout of the vaccination program has infused a lot of confidence into the formal sector. While the government looks to claim credit for this, it should not ignore the fact that public healthcare expenditure has not gone up even during the pandemic. So the writer feels that even this year's budget is likely to repeat the same trend and pattern, where the government would be looking to claim credit for few partial successes, and it would again repeat the mistake of overestimating the revenue and underestimating expenditure, thereby providing for inadequate allocation for critical areas such as public health care. For example, just look at the budget of 2019-20. In this budget, the government's estimation of revenue and expenditure was off the mark by a massive 1,50,000 crore rupees. These flaws in the budget have even been flagged by the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, and the CAG has even suggested a few methods to rectify them. But however, the centre continues to ignore the suggestions, and whenever a deficit or a shortage arises, it tends to push the burden onto the state governments and the public sector enterprises. In order to manage the mismatch, the centre pushes the state governments and PSUs to go for expensive commercial borrowings, which in turn has a long-term impact on the country's finances. So since the budget paints an inaccurate picture of the government's finances and the state of the economy, the writer suggests that it is better to look at the data that is provided by the Comptroller General of Accounts. According to the writer, this data provides a more reliable picture with regard to government revenue and public expenditure. According to this data, government revenue between the months of April to November fell by a massive 18%. This was an unexpected shock, mainly because of the pandemic and the lockdown, and the widespread suspension of economic activities definitely had a huge impact on government revenue. But that being said, a large part of this shortfall is also a result of the inaccurate revenue estimation of the government at the beginning of the financial year. Then ideally, when the country went into a lockdown and private economic activities were suspended, the economy was supposed to be kept afloat through government spending. During the lockdown period, the government did announce 3 rounds of stimulus packages. This included a package of 1.7 lakh crore rupees in the month of March, and this was followed by a massive package of 20 lakh crore rupees in the month of May. And then in November, the government announced another package of 2.65 lakh crore rupees. But however, the writer points out that most of this stimulus which was announced by the government was just a repackaging of the existing government expenditure, and the real government spending increased by just around 86,000 crore rupees, which accounted for just a meager 4.6% increase in government expenditure. Now this is not even sufficient to keep up with the inflation rate, and it essentially means that the real spending from the government actually came down during the pandemic period. In this context, the writer is calling upon the government to look at the ground reality, which paints a true picture of the state of the Indian economy. For this, the budget will have to move away from its exclusive focus on the formal sector, and the budgetary allocations should not be determined by looking at the partial recovery alone. Instead, the government should acknowledge the hardships and the sufferings being faced by millions of people in the informal sector and as well as in the lower sections of the society. Keeping these factors in mind, the union government will have to provide for a budget that provides for considerable fiscal expansion, which will not only help in reviving growth in both the formal and the informal sectors, but it should also help in creating jobs and in providing for basic goods and essential public services, especially to those who have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic and the lockdown. Then in a related column on page number 6, the writers again make a case for a substantial fiscal stimulus in the budget in order to help the Indian economy recover from the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown. See, it has been estimated that the Indian economy is going to contract by around 7.7% as a result of the pandemic-induced difficulties. But however, the RBI and the National Statistical Office, they're pointing towards the economic recovery that is currently ongoing in the Indian economy, and they have stated that the country is witnessing a V-shaped recovery. It basically means that the economy which crashed suddenly due to the pandemic and the lockdown is witnessing an exponential recovery as a direct result of revival of demand in the economy. This pattern of growth recovery is referred to as a V-shaped recovery. While the writers acknowledge that India is definitely witnessing a V-shaped recovery in the formal sector, they call upon the government to take into account the structural slowdown that the Indian economy had witnessed even before the pandemic. For almost 3 years, following the impact of demonetization and the implementation of GST regime. The growth rate of the Indian economy had collapsed from 8.2% in the fourth quarter of 2017-18 to a mere 3.1% in the fourth quarter of 2019-20. So to deal with this structural slowdown, the RBI had come out with an accommodative monetary policy, and it had substantially reduced the repo rate by around 135 basis points, and this was followed by substantial liquidity infusion by the RBI through several interventions. So this support provided by the monetary policy of the RBI was targeted support towards few sectors, and with the breakout of the pandemic and the imposition of the lockdown, both the government and the RBI stepped in to provide further support to the formal sector through their fiscal policy and monetary policy respectively. The government announced several fiscal stimulus packages, and the RBI continued with its accommodative monetary policy, followed by moratorium on loan repayments and substantial liquidity infusion. So it is this targeted support of the government and the RBI which has helped in the partial recovery of the economy, and we need to keep in mind that the current recovery that we are witnessing is limited only to a few sectors, especially in the formal economy, and it is not a broad-based recovery. Only those sectors which had received tremendous support from the government and the RBI over the last few years, they are witnessing a partial recovery, whereas the other sectors of the economy are still suffering from the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown. Now this is where a need arises for a substantial fiscal stimulus package from the government through its budget. See, the three stimulus packages that we discussed earlier, they account for just 1.8% of the country's GDP. While it is true that India cannot afford the same kind of fiscal stimulus packages that have been provided by advanced economies, it is also true that the fiscal stimulus provided by the government has been inadequate. See, the United States has provided for a massive stimulus of $5.2 trillion, and of course, there is no way that a developing country like India can afford such a fiscal stimulus package. But however, if you make a fair comparison with other similar countries, then you will notice that India's fiscal stimulus package falls way short of the global standards. India's overall fiscal stimulus package accounted for just 1.8% of its GDP, whereas other similarly placed countries such as Brazil, Russia, China, and South Africa, they have been way ahead of India in fiscally supporting their economy during the pandemic and the lockdown. The writers even refer to a suggestion of the IMF that India will have to substantially scale up its public investment in order to ensure a successful reopening of its economy. The writers also argue that any such fiscal stimulus should not just exclusively focus on the formal sector, but it should be more broad-based in order to support and revive various other sectors which have been hit by the pandemic. Accordingly, the writers call for enhanced spending on social infrastructure in order to boost public healthcare, education, and agriculture. The spending on public healthcare especially has to go up during the times of a pandemic, as the out-of-pocket expenditure on healthcare is definitely going to go up for the common man. Then the stimulus should also have substantial focus on the informal economy to restore the lost livelihoods, and it should especially focus on the small and medium enterprises which are being pushed out of business, that has directly translated into millions of job losses. So to protect livelihoods and to create employment opportunities, the government will have to make use of the budget to provide for a substantial stimulus package targeted towards small and medium enterprises and the informal economy. Then the other focus area for the stimulus package should be physical infrastructure. Because over the last 3 years, due to slowdown in the Indian economy, private investment in the creation of physical infrastructure has gone down considerably, and this has to be revived only through enhanced public expenditure. So the only way through which India can successfully recover from the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown is by one, containing the pandemic, and by further accelerating its vaccination program. Then two, the government and the RBI will have to come out with sustained macroeconomic policies and provide for sustained broad-based support to all sectors of the economy through their fiscal and monetary policies respectively. Then in another related article on page number 14, similar sentiments have been highlighted by the popular credit rating agency Moody's. Moody's has highlighted in a report that the Indian government might find it very difficult to come out with a substantial fiscal stimulus package due to high government debt. So as a result, Moody's estimates that there are several negative risks for India's growth prospects, and this includes the substantial job losses that have occurred as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown, and this has directly contributed to an income shock and an increase in income inequality. The problem has been further aggravated due to gaps in public healthcare infrastructure due to reduced government spending on public healthcare. So Moody's estimates that income and social inequality in India is going to increase further in the coming months, and the only way to counter this trend is not just to support growth through infrastructure spending in the formal sector, but also by promoting social welfare through enhanced social spending, and this calls for a massive fiscal stimulus. But at the same time, the constraint of the government is also quite understandable because of the high debt burden on the government and the risk of breaching the fiscal deficit targets. But several experts argue that this is not the time to be worried about fiscal deficit targets, and the government will have to make use of the budget to provide for a massive fiscal stimulus to revive the economy. Now let's take up an editorial from page number 6 that deals with rising inequality around the world and as well as in India. See, income-based inequality and social inequality have persisted throughout the history of mankind. But over the decades, governments around the world have given focus to welfare, that is socio-economic welfare, and this had relatively helped in bridging this inequality. But the shock events that the world faces once in a while always tends to have a disproportionate impact on the lower sections, which ends up disrupting the welfare measures and further increases the divide of inequality. The COVID-19 pandemic is one such shock event, which has not only disrupted the global economy, but it has also reversed all the gains that we had achieved over the decades through welfare programs. As we have been discussing, the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on the lower sections, and this is directly contributing to a huge increase in income inequality and social inequality. This rise in inequality has been brought out through a report by Oxfam, which is a global NGO. This report clearly illustrates the rising divide between the rich and the poor, and this has been well documented by leading economists of the world. According to the report, the 1,000 richest people of the world, they recovered their losses that had been caused by the pandemic and the lockdown in a span of just 9 months. Whereas it would take a poor person more than 1 decade to come back to the same standard of living that they were enjoying in the pre-pandemic days. In India as well, the report points out that inequality is back to what it was during the colonial times. This is illustrated by the fact that India's top 100 billionaires have acquired so much wealth since March 2020 that this additional wealth alone can be distributed to 138 million poor people, and each of them would get approximately around 94,000 rupees. The report also points out that in India, what an unskilled worker earns in 3 years can be earned by the richest person of the country in just 1 second. So this massive income inequality further translates into social inequality because of the prevailing discrimination in the Indian society. Discrimination on the lines of caste, religion, sex, etc. further aggravates the income inequality and turns it into social inequality. The impact of the pandemic on inequality has been so severe that it is finally being acknowledged by the government and as well as by the capitalist class. Earlier, any talk of inequality would get branded as a socialist thought, and in a capitalist world, debates related to development were not adequately acknowledging the persisting inequality in the society. While it is true that socialism has its own set of flaws, one should not forget that capitalism also comes with its own set of flaws. If socialism is known to hamper growth and competition, then capitalism is known to drive inequality even further. If socialism is known for breeding corruption, then capitalism is known for making the rich richer and the poor poorer. So the editorial points out that what we need is a mixed approach that draws upon the benefits of capitalism and as well as socialism. While a capitalist model of development is needed for promoting growth and innovation, we also need a socialist model of development to focus on welfare and social security. Or else, rising inequality in the society is going to have devastating consequences, and it could lead to political and social upheavals that could destroy democracies as we know. And we should also acknowledge the environmental impact of capitalist growth, because the environmental consequences again tend to have a disproportionate impact on the lower sections, thereby further increasing inequality. So considering the political and social consequences of rising inequality, governments and the capitalist class, they have started acknowledging the threat, and this can be seen at the upcoming summit of the World Economic Forum. The theme for this year's summit is the Great Reset, and the World Economic Forum is focusing on building cooperation amongst countries and the capitalist class to rebuild the foundation of the economic and social system of the world. The need of the hour is to build a fair economy that provides equal opportunities for the rich and the poor. And we should also focus on building a sustainable economy that reduces the disproportionate environmental impact, which is a result of blind focus on GDP-led growth. Then we should also build an economic and social system that is resilient to such shock events, because any shock event is bound to have a disproportionate impact on the poor and the lower sections. Now let's take up a few articles that are relevant for prelims. On page number 8, we have an article which makes a reference to a very important elephant corridor known as the Sigur Plateau in the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve. See, the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve is the largest protected area in the country, and it is located at the tri-junction of Tamil Nadu, Karnataka and Kerala. The Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve has been included under the UNESCO's Man and Biosphere program, and it is a part of the World Network of Biosphere Reserves. This Biosphere Reserve includes several important protected areas such as Bandipur and Nagarhole in Karnataka, Mudumalai and Satyamangalam in Tamil Nadu, Wayanad in Kerala, and this entire Biosphere Reserve functions as one single ecosystem. Within the Biosphere Reserve, we have a very important migratory corridor for animals known as the Sigur Plateau, and it is located over here in the Nilgiri district of Tamil Nadu. This plateau covers a portion of the Moyar River drainage basin, and it is considered to be a very important wildlife corridor because it establishes connectivity between the Western Ghats and the Eastern Ghats. It facilitates the movement of migratory keystone species such as elephants and tigers. See, the concept of keystone species was developed by zoologist Robert Payne. According to him, keystone species are those which have an extremely high impact on a particular ecosystem relative to its population. It basically means that there are certain species in an ecosystem which have a disproportionate impact on the health of the ecosystem despite their smaller population. Such keystone species are critical for the overall well-being of the ecosystem, and they also have an influence on other plants and animals within the ecosystem. So if there is a threat for the survival of this keystone species, and if they are wiped out within the ecosystem, then the entire ecosystem might fall apart. Examples for keystone species include the sea otter, the sea star, jaguar, wolf, etc. Many ecologists consider elephants and tigers also as keystone species, but however, this theory is also disputed by several other ecologists. Next, on page number 10, we have an article that makes a reference to the Immunization Agenda 2030 of the World Health Organization. See, this is an initiative of the WHO, and it is a global strategy to leave no one behind in the immunization program. The vision of this agenda is to ensure that we live in a world where everyone, everywhere, at every age fully benefits from vaccines to improve health and well-being by the year 2030. This agenda is seen to be integral to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, because immunization has a far-reaching impact on public health care and social services. Immunization programs are seen to be the very foundation of primary healthcare system, and they help in driving the world towards universal health coverage. So this vision and these goals of the Immunization Agenda 2030 of the WHO makes immunization critical to achieving Sustainable Development Goal number 3, which is to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. The WHO has also stated that Immunization Agenda 2030 will help in directly or indirectly achieving 13 other targets of the SDGs. To achieve this ambitious vision, the WHO has identified these strategic priorities, and it has come up with a bottoms-up strategy where there would be close engagement with the countries at the regional level. The strategy under the Immunization Agenda 2030 has been kept very adaptive and flexible in order to take into account the local circumstances so that the respective countries can come out with tailor-made strategies to suit the local context. It also provides for a feedback mechanism through which the targets shall be monitored and evaluated carefully so that based on the feedback, the strategy could be refined and updated. The focus of the WHO is to inspire action for implementation amongst the countries by setting country-specific targets and milestones. There are 4 core principles that serve as the pillars of this agenda, and accordingly, the people are placed at the center of this agenda, and the initiative is led by the respective countries and their national governments. The strategy shall be implemented through broad partnerships between global institutions, NGOs, civil society, and the governments. And the overall agenda is driven and guided by data in order to ensure that the focus of the agenda remains on the strategic priorities. Then, according to this article on page number 13, the Russian Parliament has approved a 5-year extension to the New START Treaty. See, START stands for Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, and it is a bilateral treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union that was signed in 1991. Its focus is on reducing and limiting strategic offensive arms such as nuclear weapons, including nuclear warheads and the launch vehicles. The first version of the treaty, known as START 1, was signed between the US and the Soviet Union, and it came into force in 1994. Through its final implementation that started from 2001 onwards, around 80% of the nuclear arsenal of these countries was removed, and following the expiry of this treaty in 2009, a new START treaty was negotiated and signed in 2010. This treaty came into force in 2011, and currently this is the only arms reduction treaty between the US and Russia. This new START treaty was supposed to operate for a period of 10 years, and hence in 2021 it was all set to expire. But under the terms of the treaty itself, an extension can be provided, but the extension cannot be for more than a period of 5 years at a time. So accordingly, US and Russia have been making attempts to extend the new START treaty, which would provide them more time and space to negotiate a new treaty that could replace the new START treaty. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: the Union government must adopt an expansionary fiscal stance in the upcoming budget in order to prioritize job creation, public service provision, and to speed up India's economic healing. Discuss. The second question: inequality is widening across the world, and India is no exception. Critically evaluate. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.